They say pride comes before the fall, but sometimes it is arrogance that walks in first and leaves last. My name is Audrey Vance. I am 35 years old, a single mother of 2 children, and until last Friday, I was a senior systems consultant at Albright Global Solutions, a prominent tech consultancy firm in Boston. I was not just another face in the office. For 5 years, I was the main architect behind every major system integration the firm handled. I built complex database strategies from the ground up, solved critical replication crises at 2 o'clock in the morning, and saved client accounts that other teams had nearly ruined. But none of that seemed to matter when I sat across the table from Julian Albright, the founder's son and my newly appointed boss. He did not see a seasoned strategist. He saw a stepping stone. My troubles began in earnest 4 months ago when Julian hired Clara, a fresh graduate with an impressive resume, but zero practical experience. Julian handed her to me, asking that I mentor the new employee. I did so without complaint. For 16 weeks, I spent hours every day training her, sharing my systems documentation, and explaining the intricate architecture of our biggest client, Vanguard Systems. Vanguard was a $50 million contract that I had personally managed and kept stable for 2 years. Clara was eager, but she was still learning the basics of database configuration. I spent many late evenings explaining the difference between synchronous and asynchronous replication to her, ensuring she understood the fragile data pipelines. Then came the annual company gala. It was a formal evening at a historic Boston hotel, and I was sitting at our team's table, expecting to be named the new lead systems director. It was a promotion I had earned through years of 80-hour work weeks. Instead, Julian took the stage. He adjusted his microphone, looked directly at our table, and announced that Clara was being promoted to the director role. The room erupted in applause. Julian looked down at me and said, "She outperformed you in 4 months, and she deserves this promotion." I felt a cold shock wash over me, but I maintained my composure. I smiled politely, raised my glass to Clara, and took a slow sip. But in my mind, I was already counting the hours until the workday began on Monday. The next morning, I walked into Julian's office to discuss the decision. He was sitting behind his mahogany desk, tapping a gold pen against a leather-bound notebook. When I asked him why a trainee was given command of a $50 million integration, he smirked and waved his hand dismissively. "I do not waste time negotiating with low levels," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. He leaned back, confident that I would simply fall in line. "We will handle the Vanguard Systems transition without you, Audrey. The client does not care who implements the database as long as it is done." He did not fire me, but he dropped the hint, expecting me to resign quietly so he could claim credit for my work. I did not argue. I stood up, walked back to my desk, and packed my personal belongings into a single cardboard box. As I walked out of the building, my keycard was already disabled at the main turnstile, and my access to the company's servers was revoked. I sat in my car in the parking lot, my hands trembling on the steering wheel. The anger was not from losing the job, but from the fact that Julian, a man who could not explain the basic algorithms of the systems I had built, thought he could erase me like an unwanted line item on a budget spreadsheet. He believed I had no options, but he was about to learn that when you push a dedicated professional to the wall, you do not break them. You simply force them to find another way to win. I started the engine of my sedan and drove home through the light Boston traffic, my mind racing with a mix of anxiety and determination. How would I explain this to Toby and Lily? My children depended on me. Ever since my divorce 3 years ago, I had been the sole provider. I had rebuilt our lives from scratch, paying off debts and saving every dollar I could to secure a small home in the suburbs. I had worked through weekends, sacrificing precious hours with my family to build a reputation at Albright Global Solutions. Now, in the span of a single conversation, Julian had swept all of that aside. As I pulled into our driveway, I took a deep breath, forcing my face to relax. I did not want my children to see my worry. I walked inside and was immediately greeted by the sound of laughter from the living room. Toby, my 8-year-old son, was building a massive plastic tower, while Lily, my 10-year-old daughter, was working on her homework at the dining table. I smiled, feeling a sudden wave of clarity. These children were the reason I worked so hard, and they were the reason I could not afford to fail. I made them dinner, helped Toby with his spelling words, and listened to Lily describe her school art project. Only after they were tucked safely in bed did I allow myself to sit at the kitchen table and plan my response. Julian thought he had won, but he had made one critical error. He forgot who actually built the foundation of his company's success. I opened my laptop, looking at the digital files I had legally saved on my personal drive, and began drafting a new strategy. By the time the next morning arrived, the initial wave of anger had cooled into a sharp, cold focus. Julian Albright believed I was powerless because I was a single mother with bills to pay, but he did not know about the conversation I had 3 months ago. Vanguard's systems had experienced a database failure that threatened to corrupt all the customer records. The Albright global team had panicked, but I stayed awake for 48 hours straight, rewriting the integration protocols and saving their systems. After the crisis was resolved, Beatrice Finch, the chief operating officer of Vanguard Systems, shook my hand. She told me that if I ever wanted to work with people who actually respected my expertise, I should call her directly. I had kept her business card in my wallet. That evening, after cooking dinner for Toby and Lily and tucking them into bed, I sat at my kitchen table and dialed Beatrice's number. She answered on the second ring, her voice crisp and professional. I explained that I had left Albright Global Solutions and was interested in offering my services directly to Vanguard Systems. There was a pause on the line, followed by a soft chuckle from Beatrice. "I was hoping you would call. Audrey," she said. "Come to my office tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock. Bring your portfolio and your consulting rates." The next day, I walked into Vanguard's glass headquarters. Within 2 hours, I had signed a 6-month independent consultancy agreement. The contract gave me full authority over the system integration and a rate that was double what I had been paid at Albright Global Solutions. More importantly, it had a clause that Julian could not touch. Vanguard had the right to hire independent contractors to oversee their project implementation. Starting on Monday, I was no longer a low-level employee at Albright. I was the client's lead consultant, and my first task was to audit the very team that had pushed me out. Before entering the Vanguard headquarters on Monday morning, I sat in my sedan in the visitor parking lot, staring at the towering glass building. I looked at my reflection in the rearview mirror, adjusting the collar of my blazer. For a brief second, the old doubts crept in. I was a single mother risking everything to go head-to-head with an established firm that had millions of dollars in resources. But then I pictured Julian's smirk and his dismissive words. I reminded myself of the countless crises I had resolved, the late nights I had spent coding, and the absolute stability I had brought to Vanguard's platforms. This was not just about proving Julian wrong. It was about demonstrating to Toby and Lily that competence, preparation, and self-respect were worth defending. I took a deep breath, grabbed my portfolio, and stepped out of the car. On Monday morning, I arrived at Vanguard Systems at 9 o'clock. I wore my sharpest charcoal blazer and carried a leather portfolio. I walked into conference room 4B, which was reserved for the project alignment meeting. A few minutes later, the Albright Global team filed in, laughing and discussing their plans. First came Oliver, the junior project manager, followed by Clara, who looked nervous but proud. Finally, Julian walked in, adjusting his cuffs. He stopped dead in his tracks when he saw me sitting at the head of the conference table. Julian blinked, trying to regain his composure. "Well, this is unexpected," he said, forcing a tight smile. "What are you doing here, Audrey?" I met his gaze without blinking. "Good morning, Julian," I said calmly. "Please sit down. We need to review your team's transition plan." He stared at me, confusion and anger competing on his face. "Your transition plan?" he repeated. "Yes," I replied, opening the project folder. "As of this morning, Vanguard Systems has retained me as their independent lead consultant to oversee the entire systems integration. I will be coordinating directly with your team to ensure a safe and complete handover of the databases." The word handover hung in the room like a heavy weight, and Julian's face turned pale as the realization began to set in. Julian looked at Oliver and then at Clara, hoping one of them would offer an explanation. But Oliver was busy looking at his tablet, and Clara was staring at the floor. Beatrice Finch entered the room a moment later, her heels clicking on the hardwood floor. She smiled warmly at me before taking her seat. Let us begin, Beatrice said, opening her notebook. Julian, I expect your team has prepared the database migration logs and the API documentation as Audrey requested. Julian stammered, trying to regain control of the meeting. Beatrice, there must be a misunderstanding, he said. Audrey was just a junior consultant at our firm. She does not have the capacity to manage a project of this scale. Beatrice raised an eyebrow, her expression turning cold. Audrey is the one who saved our customer databases 3 months ago, while your senior managers were scrambling, Beatrice said. She knows our architecture better than anyone. We hired her because we trust her competence, not because of a corporate hierarchy. Julian clenched his jaw, realizing he could not argue with the client. I watched him sit down, his movements stiff and awkward. The tables had turned completely. For the next 2 hours, I led the meeting, asking detailed questions about the database schemas, the synchronization windows, and the security protocols. Julian tried to answer, but he repeatedly stumbled over the technical details, forcing Oliver to speak up. Clara remained silent, her face flushed with embarrassment, as she realized the true depth of the responsibility she had accepted without proper training. I kept my tone professional and calm, letting my expertise do the talking. As the meeting progressed, Julian's frustration became increasingly obvious. He kept shifting in his seat, looking around the room before finally speaking up. "This is a clear breach of our partnership," he stammered, looking at Beatrice Finch. "Albright Global Solutions is under a strict retainer with Vanguard Systems." Before he could speak further, Beatrice cut him off with a wave of her hand. "Actually, Julian," Beatrice said, sitting down next to me, "our retainer with your firm is for general advisory services. The core implementation contract is a separate agreement. As of last Friday, that agreement is with Audrey Vance. We chose Audrey because she built this database and knows our systems better than anyone else. We need results, not titles." I watched the remaining color drain from Julian's face. Throughout the rest of the alignment session, Julian tried to assert his authority. He offered suggestions and corrected Oliver, but every time he spoke, Beatrice would look at me for confirmation. I answered every question with precise technical data, showing that Clara's transition plan was missing critical security protocols. Clara sat silently, looking down at her notepad, realizing she had been set up to fail by a boss who did not understand the project. After the meeting ended, Julian stayed behind while his team filed out of the room. He walked over to me, his voice low and angry. "What is your game, Audrey?" he hissed. "You think you can embarrass me in front of my clients?" I closed my binder slowly and stood up to face him. "There is no game, Julian," I said. "You told me you did not waste time negotiating with low levels. I simply took your advice and found someone who would." His eyes narrowed in fury. "You will regret this," he muttered. "This is not over." I smiled and walked past him, my heart racing but my head held high. When I got home that evening, I sat at my desk and began reviewing the technical documents Julian's team had submitted for the database transition. As I analyzed the code, I found a major systems error. It was the same synchronization bug I had warned Julian about 3 months ago. He had ignored my warning to save time and money. If Vanguard Systems went live with this code, their entire customer database would be exposed, causing millions of dollars in damages and violating federal privacy laws. I had a choice. I could let the system fail and watch Julian's firm burn, or I could do my job. I chose my job. I spent 4 hours drafting a comprehensive remediation report, explaining the bug, the potential risks, and the exact steps needed to fix it. I emailed the report directly to Beatrice Finch and copied Julian. I did not need to sabotage him. His own laziness was my strongest weapon. The technical error I discovered was a critical concurrency issue in the database transaction log. When multiple users attempted to update their profiles simultaneously, the system would create a deadlock, resulting in data loss. During my final weeks at Albright Global, I had written a patch to resolve this issue. But Julian had ordered the team to deploy the cheaper, unpatched version to meet the deadline. By sending the remediation report, I was exposing this shortcut to Vanguard's executive team. Specifically, the deadlock occurred because the database engine attempted to escalate database row locks into full table locks under heavy loads. This prevented any concurrent read or write transactions, leading to query timeouts and eventual data corruption. I had designed a lock-free transactional model using optimistic concurrency control, which eliminated the need for heavy database locking. Julian, however, had stripped this code out of the production release, calling it unnecessary technical overhead that delayed the project milestone. The next morning, I received a phone call from Beatrice Finch. "Audrey, we reviewed your report," she said. "Our chief information officer is horrified. If we had deployed Albright's version, we would have suffered a major security breach. Thank you for catching this. I want you to lead the remediation team immediately." I agreed, outlining the timeline and the resources I would require. I also knew that Julian would be furious when he realized his shortcut had been exposed. At the next technical alignment meeting, Julian tried to defend the sloppy code. He claimed that the integration parameters provided by Vanguard were outdated and that his team had simply followed the guidelines. He tried to shift the blame to my past work. I was prepared for this. I opened my archive files and projected the emails from 3 months ago onto the screen. In those messages, I had explicitly flagged the deadlock issue and provided the correction plan. Julian's response back then was a one-line email telling me to ignore it and focus on cosmetic features. The room went silent. Julian looked at the screen, his face turning red as his own written orders were displayed for everyone to see. Clara looked at him in disbelief, realizing he had lied to her about the project status. Beatrice nodded slowly. "I believe we have seen enough," she said. "Audrey, please proceed with your remediation." The battle was intensifying, but I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. I was protecting the client and proving my worth, one line of code at a time. By Wednesday morning, the effects of my remediation report were felt across the industry. The Chief Information Officer of Vanguard Systems called me personally to thank me, noting that my discovery had saved the company from a multi-million-dollar disaster. Meanwhile, the pressure on Albright Global Solutions began to mount. 2 senior database administrators on Julian's team resigned, citing poor leadership, and updated their profiles online. I even received a private message from Clara. She apologized for accepting the promotion and admitted that Julian had pressured her to take the role so he could cut my salary. She asked if I would consider hiring her if she left the firm. I thanked her for her honesty but made no promises. Clara explained during our private conversation that Julian had threatened to fire her and blacklist her from entry-level consultancy roles if she did not agree to take the lead systems director title. He wanted a compliant figurehead who would sign off on his reports without asking questions, allowing him to bypass security protocols. Hearing this made me feel a mix of sympathy and frustration. I told Clara that while I understood the pressure she was under, she had to protect her own professional integrity. I advised her to document all her communications with Julian and keep copies of her performance logs. It was a sobering reminder of how Julian used junior employees as human shields for his own corporate negligence. Julian, however, was not planning to go down quietly. On Thursday afternoon, I received an email from Nolan Brooks, the head of legal at Albright Global Solutions. The email contained a formal cease and desist letter accusing me of breach of contract, violation of non-compete clauses, and theft of proprietary information. The letter threatened a lawsuit if I did not resign from my position at Vanguard Systems immediately. It was a classic scare tactic designed to intimidate me. But I was prepared. I hired Gwen Fletcher, a sharp attorney who specialized in corporate law. We met at her office in downtown Boston. Gwen reviewed my original employment contract with Albright Global Solutions and laughed. "They have no case, Audrey," Gwen said, leaning back in her chair. "First, the non-compete clause they wrote is far too broad to be enforceable under Massachusetts law. Under the state regulations, specifically the Massachusetts Non-Compete Agreement Act, an employer must provide garden leave or other mutually agreed-upon consideration to make such a restriction valid. Albright Global Solutions did neither. Second, you wrote the core integration code on your own time, using open-source libraries, which means they cannot claim exclusive ownership. We are going to file a proactive defense. We will countersue them for tortious interference with your business relationship with Vanguard. And we will cite Massachusetts General Laws, Chapter 93A for unfair and deceptive business practices." That evening, Julian escalated his campaign. Clara texted me to warn me that Julian was calling other tech firms in Boston, spreading false rumors that I was being sued for stealing trade secrets. He was trying to destroy my professional reputation so that no other client would ever hire me. I felt a moment of panic, but I remembered that I was no longer alone. The next day, I received an unexpected email from Chloe, the former HR manager at Albright Global Solutions, who had resigned 2 weeks prior. Chloe attached several internal documents, including emails from Julian instructing HR to manipulate my performance reviews to justify denying my promotion. I forwarded the files to Gwen immediately. We now had proof of malice. Gwen and I spent the weekend preparing our legal response. She explained that under Massachusetts law, an employer cannot enforce a non-compete agreement if the employee was terminated without cause or pushed out through unfair means. Julian's decision to manipulate my performance reviews and deny my promotion was clear evidence of bad faith. Furthermore, by spreading false rumors to my prospective clients and colleagues, Julian was committing defamation per se, which would allow us to seek significant damages. We also received support from Simon, a junior systems analyst at Albright, whom I had mentored. He sent us screenshots of the internal database logs, showing that Julian had accessed my older code repositories after my departure. Trying to find anything he could claim was proprietary. Simon was terrified of losing his job, but he could not stand by and watch Julian destroy my career. I thanked him and assured him that his identity would remain protected. With Chloe's HR files and Simon's technical logs, Gwen drafted a powerful response. We were not just playing defense anymore. We were preparing to dismantle Julian's entire legal campaign. On Monday morning, Gwen sent a formal response to Nolan Brooks. We included copies of the emails showing the review manipulation and a draft of the lawsuit we were prepared to file in state court. We gave them 48 hours to retract their threats and issue a formal apology. I knew Julian would be furious, but he was running out of moves. The legal net was closing around him, and he was finally beginning to realize that I was not a low-level employee who could be easily silenced. In our legal warning, Gwen also noted that if they proceeded to file a groundless lawsuit based on bad faith claims, we would immediately seek sanctions under the Massachusetts Rules of Civil Procedure. She pointed out that a Chapter 93A claim would open the door for double or treble damages, as well as mandatory attorney's fees, which would make Julian's personal financial liability incredibly high. I sat in Gwen's office, looking out over the historic Boston Common, feeling a sense of empowerment I had not felt in years. The law was on my side, and I had the evidence to back it up. I knew we were prepared for whatever Julian threw at us next. On Monday morning, Gwen Fletcher filed our lawsuit in the state court. The complaint was a devastating document, detailing Julian's retaliation, the manipulated performance reviews, the false rumors he spread to damage my reputation, and his attempt to force Vanguard Systems to use corrupted code. We demanded damages for defamation, breach of the covenant of good faith, and triple damages under Chapter 93A of the Massachusetts General Laws. Within 24 hours, the story was picked up by local business journals. The headline in the Boston Business Times read, "Albright Global Solutions faces lawsuit over retaliation and systems failure." The response from Albright's board of directors was immediate. The board, realizing that Julian's arrogance was about to cost them their reputation and their $50 million contract with Vanguard, intervened. Julian was placed on administrative leave pending an investigation. On Thursday, Nolan Brooks, the head of legal, called Gwen to offer a settlement. They offered me a cash payment of $300,000 to drop the lawsuit. I told Gwen that I would only accept the settlement if it included a public apology, the immediate resignation of Julian Albright, and the removal of all non-compete clauses for their employees. They tried to negotiate, but Vanguard Systems threatened to terminate their entire advisory contract with Albright if they did not resolve the matter. By Friday afternoon, the board capitulated. They agreed to all my terms. Albright Global Solutions issued a public statement acknowledging that they had mishandled my employment transition, confirming my ownership of the integration code, and apologizing for any negative statements made about my professionalism. Julian resigned from the company in disgrace, and his father stripped him of his shares in the firm. The victory was complete, but the best part was going home. That evening, I sat on the porch with Toby and Lily. Lily looked at me and said, "You look happy, Mom, like you are not carrying heavy things anymore." I smiled and hugged her close. I was no longer the low-level employee that a wealthy founder's son could dismiss. I was the master of my own career. The following week, Beatrice Finch offered me a permanent position as the director of systems. Architecture at Vanguard Systems, with a salary that was 3 times what I had earned at Albright. I accepted the offer, knowing that I had not just survived the betrayal, I had rebuilt my life on my own terms. Arrogance had walked in first, but competence had the last word. In the months that followed, the impact of the settlement was felt far beyond my own career. The removal of the non-compete clauses allowed several other talented consultants at Albright Global Solutions to leave the firm and start their own businesses. Claire eventually resigned and joined a startup where she was able to develop her skills under proper guidance. Simon, the junior systems analyst I had mentored, was promoted to a senior role, and he emailed me to thank me for proving that quality and integrity still mattered in our industry. The board's forced public retraction remained on the front page of Albright's website for 90 days, serving as a reminder to the entire industry that employees could no longer be silenced through intimidation. The terms of the settlement also required the firm to establish an independent ethics committee to review all promotions and performance evaluations, preventing any future executive from manipulating reviews for personal vendettas. It was a structural reform that protected over 100 employees who were still working at the firm. Furthermore, Julian's father personally took over the operations of the company, restructuring the leadership team to emphasize transparency and meritocracy. On my first official day as the Director of Systems Architecture at Vanguard Systems, Beatrice Finch welcomed me with a brand new office overlooking the Boston Harbor. I stood at my window, watching the ships move across the water, feeling a profound sense of peace. I was now in a position to hire people like Simon and Chloe, building a team where respect, collaboration, and engineering excellence were valued over politics and nepotism. A few days later, Beatrice, Gwen, and I met for lunch at a quiet restaurant overlooking the historic waterfront to celebrate our legal and professional victory. As we raised our glasses, Beatrice smiled and said, "To competence, fair play, and the courage to stand up to bullies." I clinked my glass against theirs, realizing that the journey had not only transformed my own career, but had also set a precedent for how tech firms in Boston treated their senior staff. As I sat in my new glass office at Vanguard Systems, looking out over the Boston Harbor, I felt a deep sense of accomplishment. I had not sought revenge out of spite, but out of a need for justice and self-preservation. By standing up to Julian Albright, I had protected my family, my profession, and my own sense of worth. I had shown my children that when someone tries to make you feel small, you do not have to accept their definition of you. You can stand tall, do the work, and let the truth speak for itself. It was the ultimate victory, and it was one I had earned with every single line of code, every late night, and every quiet decision to refuse to disappear.